Today we are going to talk about nutritional management in ICU. Now you see what happens when you are dealing with the patients in the intensive care unit. Most of the time you are focusing on condition of the patient, on his vitals, what antibiotics are to be administered. If he has a disturbed blood sugar level, your attention is more towards all those things, and the least attended is nutrition. But nutrition is very, very important. So, today we are going to talk about the nutrition management in ICU. The contents of my talk would be introduction to the subject, metabolic response to stress, how does stress affect the metabolic response or affects the response of the body, how are you going to assess the nutrition, then estimating macronutrient requirements, nutritional therapy. So once you decide that yes, some supplementation of the nutrition is required in this patient, so what will be the principles and what will be the options, we are going to discuss that. Then we have some special considerations, and also we have to take into consideration the complications, what complications can take place. So, malnutrition contributes greatly to illness, mortality and cost of healthcare. So, it affects all the three. The mortality and cost of the healthcare also gets affected because of the mismanagement of the nutrition, because the patient as such is not able to eat. Sometimes any small illness also results in loss of appetite, and they may not be taking the adequate diet orally. So, we have to take into consideration the condition of the nutrition, and the incidence is nearly 30 to 55%. So, three types of malnutrition we come across. One is marasmus, prolonged non-stress starvation, kwashiorkor like hypoalbuminic state, acute in onset. It is stress resulting in visceral protein loss, and then marasmic hypoalbuminic stress induced loss of adaptive mechanisms. So the adaptive mechanisms also get affected because of the low albumin. So what will be the indications for nutritional support? Preventing and treating malnutrition of patients, those who are either unable or unwilling to take oral feeding, because many times because of the head condition they just don't feel like eating. But we cannot leave them like that, that he is not cooperating, he is not acting. I have asked him so many times, but still he is not obeying our orders. That's not the solution. We have to take care of the patient. Then there is situation during the acute phase of stressful illness. So goal is to provide energy substance to aid cellular functions, because if person is malnourished, all the cellular functions of the body also get deranged, and that will affect the outcome of the patient. So repletion of lost fat and muscle tissue must wait until the anabolic phase of illness. Now you can see here how metabolism gets affected. Normally there is a difference between anabolism and catabolism. So anabolism is formation of the newer cells in the body, organs in the body, and catabolism is degradation of the cellular cells of the various organs of the body. So this cycle is all. Here you can see that as a seesaw, the anabolism goes down and catabolism further increases during the stage of illness. And how does it affect the metabolism? Because when you take diet, you take amino acids, you take glucose, you take fatty acids. So these fatty acids, they get converted into triglycerides and form adipose tissue. The glucose goes to the liver and gets converted into glycogen, and it goes to the muscle, and the waste product is urea, which is excreted. And the other thing which you get from the diet is protein. So amino acids, they also help in muscle building. Starvation, what happens in starvation? There is depressed glucose intake. So the lower glucose level in the blood is maintained by two mechanisms. Fatty acids used. So how body is going to tackle this situation when the blood glucose is low in the body? One is fatty acids are used as alternative fuel, because glucose is the source of energy, and if you are not having adequate amount of glucose, then the fat body starts using fatty acids as an alternative fuel. There is activation of glucose producing pathways. So there are other pathways which are not functioning, but during such situation, these pathways, they are activated. There is glycogenolysis. Since glycogen is stored is limited, this can't last for more than 48 hours. Gluconeogenesis also takes place. Other carbon sources used to produce glucose in liver and to lesser extent in kidneys. Substrates for gluconeogenesis are lactate, pyruvate, which supplies 60 to 70% of the carbon, glycerol derived from triglycerides, amino acids from peripheral tissue and liver. So factors that decrease mitochondrial oxidation and thus increase lactate production increase gluconeogenesis. So starvation, 90% inhibition of the whole body glucose oxidation is there. In type 1 diabetes mellitus, 70% inhibition is there, whereas in type 2 diabetes mellitus there is inhibition of 40%. Alanine is used as a substrate for transmission reactions in the liver and kidney. In cases of protein breakdown, amino acids act as substrates of gluconeogenesis via alanine. That is why in malnutrition, exogenous glucose is essential to spare the loss of body protein mass, because otherwise the alternative sources of energy are used, and that is going to further result in loss of the body mass. And what happens in prolonged starvation? Ketone bodies are produced from incomplete oxidation of fatty acids. This is body's adoption mechanism. Some cells such as cardiac, muscle and kidney cells adopt to use ketone bodies as fuel. So normally all these vital organs which are continuously functioning, heart, muscle, kidney, so they require oxygen, and when the oxygen supply is low, so they learn how to extract energy from the other sources. So they start consuming the ketone bodies. As a result, what happens? There is muscle protein is spared and the need for glucose is reduced. So what is the response to the stress? Allostasis mechanisms become insufficient to maintain hemostasis. So there are three phases of responses to stress. EBV phase 24 hours, then there is a flow phase, and then there is anabolic phase. So during EBV phase, there would be a hypoperfusion, hypoxia, hypometabolism, and resuscitative measures are important during this phase. During the flow phase, there is catabolism and hypermetabolism. Its duration depends on severity of the injury. So this is the response of the stress. Now during anabolic phase, there is repair of injury and return to normal metabolic environment. In second, it hits the changes will be perpetuated. Hypothalamus pituitary axis is central. Allostatic means to overcome the changes. Now, stress-induced hormone response via stimulation of hypothalamus by humoral factors, TNF alpha and interleukin 1 and limbic system. It's emotional factors. So, stimulated hypothalamus will result in it activates sympathetic nervous system. It adjusts body temperature and releases hormones to stimulate pituitary gland. So the response to stress from the hypothalamus, there is sympathetic nervous system which gets affected, pituitary gland and body temperature regulation, it is governed by the hypothalamus. So sympathetic nervous system acts via adrenal medulla, pancreas, cardiovascular system. Pancreas will produce more glucagon to preserve glucose. Adrenal medulla will secrete more catecholamines. Pituitary through the ACTH, it secretes adrenocorticotropic hormone, so it will increase the cortisol production. It also stimulates the growth hormone production, and body temperature regulation is also taken care of by hypothalamus. So glucocorticoids, what do they do? Secretion is normally by circadian rhythm, by control of hypothalamus pituitary axis. In stress state, secretion increases 2 to 3-fold, and exogenous steroids attenuate response by negative feedback mechanisms. So this is the effect of if you give steroids exogenously, they affect the secretion of the steroids. And what is the action of cortisol? It activates gluconeogenesis. More production of glucose through the liver, that is activated by cortisol. It also sensitizes adipose tissue for lipolytic hormones. It increases proteolysis, so there is further breakdown of the protein, and insulin resistance is also there. So anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive effects are good, but some of these effects are not desirable. So duration of action depends on degree of the trauma. Growth hormone. So during stress under the stress, it has diaphasic response. Initial 2 to 3 hours, insulin-like effect. Later, anti-insulin-like and anabolic effect. Amino acids used for protein synthesis, insulin resistance and glucose intolerance, lipolysis by stimulation of catecholamines. Now, glucagon and insulin. During surgery, glucagon insulin ratio increases. This is an effect of sympathetic nervous system activation and release of catecholamines, as we saw in our last slide. So post-operatively, the requirement of insulin increases. In sepsis, these mechanisms fail and hypoglycemia results because of this. So sometimes we are surprised why this patient has got such a low sugar, there is no history of diabetes, patient is not taking any oral hypoglycemic agents. So this is the sepsis. By this mechanism, it results in hypoglycemia. Then the question comes, how are we going to assess the nutrition? Because if we are not able to assess, how are you going to extend the health? So the assessment of nutrition, one simple method is just go for the weight. Whether he has normal weight or whether he is above weight, too much above weight is also considered as malnutrition. Then the albumin. During stress, liver is responsible for producing albumin, and in the disease stress it does not produce the required amount of insulin, albumin. Now pre-albumin, a carrier protein which remains low if stress is not addressed. So you have to focus your attention on stress. Otherwise, this carrier protein gets affected. Normal is 16 milligram per deciliter, and it is determined once or twice weekly. The energy requirements. So, kilocalories per kilogram body weight according to weight and activity classification. The ideal weight and activity level from a general chart can be used to obtain multiplication factors. So, in various situations, the requirement of the calories shall vary. Totally bedridden patient having some activities or struggling for some or other reason in the bed, he allowed some movements, what is his weight, and what is the amount of stress by the disease, it will all affect the requirement of the nutrition. So kilocalories. So how do we calculate? We take BEE multiplied by activity factor and stress factor. There are two methods to ascertain basal energy expenditure. So BEE, I have been telling you, it must be, you have heard it in my previous slides also, that is basal energy expenditure. How much body is basal metabolic rate. Some amount of energy continuously person is using. Even if he is sedentary, he has to spend certain energy. So that is basal energy expenditure. And indirect calorimetry can be used, or prediction equation. The gold standard of which is the Harris-Benedict equation. So there are certain equations which help you in calculating the basal energy expenditure. Because once you know basal energy expenditure, you can apply the formula and calculate the requirement. So once this basal energy expenditure has been determined, that figure is multiplied by activity factor, then an injury factor to determine total energy needs. So Harris-Benedict equation is basal energy expenditure kilocalories per day, supposing it is 66.5 plus 13.8 multiplied by weight and plus 5 multiplied by height minus 6.8 in women. It is 655.1 plus 9.1 multiplied by weight plus 1.8 multiplied by height and 4.7 multiplied by A, where weight in kilogram, H stands for height, height is in centimeter, and A is age in years. So you have to take into consideration the weight, height and the age and basal energy expenditure. Now the energy requirements. So activity factor. Activity factor is bed rest or it may be ambulatory. And anabolic factor. Mild weight loss 1.05. Moderate to severe weight loss 1.1 to 1.15. So around 1 is mild, 1.1 to 1.15 is moderate to severe. So this is about the activity factor and anabolic factor. Third, the other thing which we require is injury factor. So if somebody goes minor surgery, the injury factor will be 1.2. If there is major surgery, means 1.1 to 1.2. If somebody has a mild infection, the infection is not very severe, but still he needs hospitalization in ICU. So the injury factor will be 1 to 1.8. Moderate infection, it will be 1.2 to 1.4. In severe infection, it will be more, 1.4 to 1.8. If there is skeletal trauma, so naturally it will go high, to 1.2 to 1.35. Blunt trauma, 1.5 to 1.35. So head trauma, 1.4. Less than 20% BSA burns These are the ranges. What happens if the injury factor is between 1 to 1.5, 1.5 to 1.85 and 1.85 to 1.95. So the recommendations. What will be the recommendations? So what is required by a normal patient? It is 25 to 30 kilocalories per kilogram per day. If somebody is underweight, you want that he is not very good and he should eat more, so you will have to ask him to consume something which provides him more kilocalories. So there you have to raise the requirement. So they will require the underweight 35 to 40 kilocalories per kilogram per day. And the other thing is obese. They are also malnourished, but the management is different. In an undernourished, we like to give more kilocalories, wherein obese we want that he should lose weight. So there, the recommendation would be around 20 to 25 kilocalories per kilogram per day. Morbidity. Obese patients in very morbid condition, it will go down 10 to 20%. 10 to 20 kilocalories per kilogram per day. And refeeding syndrome 20. So that was about the how much kilocalories are required by a person under various conditions. After having calculated that, we have to take into consideration how are we going to meet out these calories, from where are you going to get it. One is protein. So protein is calculated by how many grams per kilogram, or that is one method. Another one is nitrogen balance method. So the simplest but least precise method to estimate protein needs is by multiplying IBW in kilograms by a factor appropriate for the patient's condition. The other thing which we talked about is nitrogen balance method. That is another way of calculating how much protein requirement would be there. A nitrogen balance study is the comparison of nitrogen being consumed orally or via intravenously compared to the amount of nitrogen being lost from the body. So nitrogen in the food and nitrogen goes out. Either you are going total parenteral nutrition or patient is having oral. So that is the nitrogen, amount of nitrogen getting inside the body. And it comes out. It will come out from 4 places. You lose it from the urine, in the feces, through the sweat and the skin. So steps to calculate nitrogen balance. Determine nitrogen lost in the urine by 24-hour urinary urea nitrogen test. So ask the patient that he should collect his urine in one single part for 24 hours, and that is submitted for analyzing and calculating the nitrogen lost in 24 hours. So that helps you that how much protein will be required. Add 4 to the urinary urea nitrogen to account for non-urinary losses of nitrogen. We just talked about there is non-urinary losses in the skin, through the sweat, through the feces. So determine nitrogen intake by dividing the daily protein intake by 6.25. So balance value will be vary from 3 to 4. So negative nitrogen balance is an undesirable state, where the patient is not getting the required amount of protein, will result in negative nitrogen balance, and that is not desired. That occurs when there is loss of weight, there is traumatic injury, some other stressful conditions or illnesses. The best nutritional support can deter muscle loss by no more than 50%. So the protein requirements, the non-protein kilocalories to nitrogen ratio is calculated as follows. Calculate grams of nitrogen supplied per day. 1 gram nitrogen is equal to 6.25 grams of protein. Divide total non-protein calories by grams of nitrogen. 80:1 is the most severely stressed patients, 100:1 is severely stressed patients, and 150:1 unstressed patients. So this is how we will calculate. Now, principles of nutritional therapy. First principle is early management is better than late. So, no need to put the patient for pretty long time on only IV fluids. You have to take into consideration the nutrition of the patient. And that is why early management is better than late. Another thing, how are you going to extend nutrition to the patient? So there are two ways. One is enteral, you take to the mouth. Another is parenteral, that other than mouth, in whatever manner you can extend nutrition to the patient. So then after taking into consideration whether I am going to allow oral nutrition or parenteral, so you have to decide the dose of enteral nutrition, what will be the composition of the nutrition, and optimizing enteral nutrition. Early management, that is not later than 48 hours, is associated with good outcomes. So various trials have been conducted where they have taken into consideration the effects of extending nutrition and the outcome of the patient from various illnesses, not only one single illness. So early management is not later than 48 hours is associated with good outcomes, means 2 days. After you receive a patient, by that time already 8-10 hours might have lost. So see that after a day or on third day you are able to extend the nutritional support to the patient. However, patient should be well resuscitated and hemodynamically stable. So that is another thing which you have to take into consideration, that you are not doing any harm by extending the support. Enteral nutrition is preferred to total parenteral nutrition. It uses normal physiological action of digestion and absorption. So whenever you take oral nutrition, all your systems are getting activated and you just have to digest your food like in a normal healthy condition. You don't have to take extra pains. So that is why enteral nutrition is preferred. Now enteral nutrition can be given by GI tract by feeding. You can put in a rice tube or other measures are also there. So what are the benefits? What are the benefits of enteral nutrition? First, maintains gut integrity by preserving immunoglobulin A production. It prevents diuretic ileus. It attenuates metabolic response to stress. Decreased incidence of stress-induced bleeding. And prevents infectious complications when started early. So these are the benefits of enteral nutrition. Now, hemodynamic stability is a prerequisite for starting enteral nutrition. So, what will be the indications when you will like to go for enteral nutrition? So, protein energy malnutrition with adequate oral intake for 5 or more days. Less than 50% of required nutrient intake orally for 5 to 7 days. So these are the indications where you will promote enteral nutrition. Severe dysphagia. Patient is in coma. Low output enterocutaneous fistula. Then what are the contraindications? The contraindications are intestinal obstruction, ileus or hypomotility of the intestine, severe diarrhea, high output enterocutaneous fistulas, severe acute pancreatitis or shock when prognosis does not warrant aggressive nutritional support. So these are the situations where enteral nutrition cannot be extended. It can be administered through the tube, rice tube in the stomach, or duodenal tube, or jejunal feeding tube for those at risk of pulmonary aspiration. Because many times patient is not in his full senses, and we have to take into consideration that there is no, patient does not vomit, or he may, regurgitation of the fluid might take place and it may result in aspiration pneumonia. So what are the various formulas? So polymorphic formulas which contain unaltered molecule of protein, fat and carbohydrate. Hydrolyzed monometric formulas contain pre-digested protein and simple carbohydrates plus a small amount of oil or a blend of medium chain triglyceride. Modular is incomplete liquid supplement that contains specific nutrients, usually a single macronutrient. The presence of bowel sound is unnecessary for initiation of tube feeding. It is not necessary that patient should have, we should be able to hear the burbling. It is not essential. But you have to see that there is no paralytic ileus. So ways of administration will be either we give a continuous drip, or we can give it intermittently, or it can be cyclic. The continuous drip feeding, it can be done with the help of gravity or a pump. It is better tolerated. So gravity means just hang it upside. With the effect of gravity, the fluid will come down through the tube and you can connect it with the rice tube. It is better tolerated. The initial rate should be slow, then steady rate is maintained. The another one is intermittent bolus feeding. That consists of approximately 250 to 300 ml of nutrient is given over a period of 20 minutes to 2 hours, followed by 25 ml to 60 ml of water, and at least 3 hours between each bolus feeding. There should be after, once you have given from 20 minutes to 2 hours, 250 to 300 ml of the fluid. So thereafter, the gap of 3 hours should be there. Then the other one is cyclic feeding. So here in cyclic feeding, what we do, we usually as a supplement to an inadequate oral intake. Whenever you feel that patient is not having adequate intake, you can consider cyclic feeding. Provided often by a pump over 8 to 12 hours per day or continuous drip. So monitoring. How are you going to monitor the nutritional? Gastric residual volume should be ordered 4 hourly for patients fed with nasogastric tube or gastrostomy tubes. Elevated right ventricle is an indication to elevated residual volume is an indication to withhold feeding and look for the cause. Tight glycemic control and electrolyte management. So what you have to look for is glucose, electrolytes, and how much residual food is there in the stomach after feeding. And measures. So before each bolus, whenever you start feeding, before each bolus feeding, gastric content should be suctioned out and returned to the stomach before a new feeding is administered to ensure that minimal residue remains from previous feeding. So that is how you are going to decide whether the residual volume is too much. Otherwise you will have to restrict the amount of nutrient to be fed. So the gastric residual volume is used as a marker for risk of aspiration. It is acceptable. What is acceptable? How much you may suck out the fluid from the stomach, and you get 250 to 300 ml, so it is acceptable. But if the gastric residual volume is more than 250 to 350 ml, we will have to restrict the amount of fluid to be administered. So simply changing patient's position to right side may reduce residual volume. Patient should be positioned with the head elevated 30 degrees before and after feeding. So before and after feeding, it should be elevated 30 degrees. Gastric stimulants can be given to improve gastric motility, because most of the time when patient or anybody is lying in the bed, all the systems they become sluggish. So we can take help of certain things which can increase the gastric motility so that the gastric residual volume is not much. So what can be used? You can use metoclopramide, you can use erythromycin, naloxone or domperidone. Now prevention of bacterial contamination is crucial, especially when blenderized formulas. Administration of medicine, tubes should be flushed before and after administration of the medicine. So monitoring of tolerance. Symptoms to look for include whether your supplementation is resulting in diarrhea, nausea, cramping, constipation, aspiration. The hydration status can be monitored via daily weight, BUN and electrolyte. Hypoalbuminemia is commonly implicated in the development of diarrhea among complications of tube feeding. What complications can happen? Just now I told you. So dumping syndrome and regurgitation. And another is diarrhea, and that can lead to dehydration. Calculation. How are you going to calculate? Calculation of kilocalories and protein needs of the tube-fed patient is essential. So obligatory fluid output, the adequacy of fluid intake of patient can be estimated with the UOP. It is minimum output of urine necessary to remove waste and is estimated to be 700 ml per day or 30 ml per unit. So urine output, either you see how much he or she is excreting hourly basis, or at the minimum per day 700 urine output should be there. That will help you in deciding how much is to be given. And that was in tube feeding or enteral. When we talk about parenteral nutrition, it is the use of a site outside the GI tract. Now we are not putting the food into the GI tract but outside, especially the circulatory system for feeding. The general rule for deciding whether to use enteral or parenteral feeding is, if the gut works, use it. If the gut works, use it. administered peripherally by a central route. Now, what are the indications for parenteral nutrition? So, GI tract obstruction. Of course, if there is obstruction in the GI tract and you are not going to submit that patient for surgery for some or other reason, the patient should not start. So, after 48 hours, as we have said, supplementation of nutrition is good. So, that is one, GI tract obstruction, ileus, severe malabsorption, persistent nausea and vomiting. Unusable GIT for 5 to 7 days. If GIT is not going to be used for 5 to 7 days, you can go for parenteral nutrition. Now the peripheral parenteral nutrition. Here peripheral vein is used. Instead of central vein, peripheral vein is used. It provides partial or complete nutrition depending on solution osmolarity. A hypertonic parenteral nutrition solution results in an osmotic gradient that causes water to enter the blood vessel. Vessel wall becomes inflamed and thrombosed. So protein and carbohydrate both contribute to hypertonicity. Fat is isotonic and can therefore be administered peripherally. Up to 1800 to 2500 kilocalories and 90 grams proteins can be supplied for short time only. It cannot be used for a very long time. The recommended infusion rates for peripheral parenteral nutrition are body weight and infusion rate. So you can consult the chart. Central peripheral nutrition. Parenteral nutrition. Large amounts of nutrients in a hypertonic solution can be supplied via TPN. Catheter is surgically placed into the superior vena cava. You can see it in the diagram. Now what is the composition? The composition of this fluid will be amino acid solutions used for protein synthesis rather than energy supplementation. So whenever you are supplementing amino acids, you are doing it for synthesis of the protein and not for gaining the calories. So protein is provided as a crystalline amino acid solution. Solutions vary in amino acid concentration and amino acid composition. Non-protein kilocalories to nitrogen ratio of 80:1 to 150:1 is used. Dextrose solutions. Dextrose in solution has 3.4 kilocalories per gram rather than 4 kilocalories per gram. So dextrose solutions come in different concentrations and the solution is abbreviated the percent. So and so whatever the percentage may be there. For example, D50 indicates 50% dextrose in water solution. The maximum oxidation rate of glucose allows dextrose solution not to be administered above 0.3 grams per kilogram body weight per hour. So this you have to take into consideration. It should not be more than 0.36 gram per kilogram body weight per hour. Excess glucose is converted to fat, that gets converted to fatty liver. That results in fatty liver. In addition, the conversion results in excess carbon dioxide production, which is undesirable for patients with respiratory problems. So glucose is to be given cautiously. Lipid emulsions. Lipids in parenteral nutrition are used as a source of essential fatty acids and energy. They are composed of soybean and or safflower oil, glycerol and egg phospholipids, omega-6 fatty acids. Approximately 4% of total caloric intake should be essential fatty acids. Since IV lipids are isotonic and calorically dense, They are a good source of kilocalories for hypermetabolic patients or patients with volume or carbohydrate restriction. IV lipid comes in bottle of 10% or 20% emulsion. The 10% emulsion contains 1.1 kilocalories per ml. The 20 ml emulsion contains 2 kilocalories per ml. To prevent hyperlipidemia, lipid emulsions are not provided continuously. Typically, lipids are administered 2 to 3 times per week but can be provided daily. Infusion times of 4 to 6 hours for 10% lipids and 8 to 12 hours for 20% lipids are recommended. It can be immunosuppressive and pro-inflammatory in high concentration. So if the concentrations of lipid are high, it will suppress the immunity and it will invite infections or it will aggravate the inflammation. So in any event, a total of 2.5 grams per kilogram lipid per day should not be exceeded. So evaluation of patient lipid tolerance, whether the patient is tolerating the test dose. Initially give a test dose, see whether he tolerates it. Then you can estimate serum triglycerides. Serum triglycerides should not exceed 250 milligram per day. Plasma turbidity. This is how you are going to evaluate the tolerance of the lipid in a patient. The contraindications for using lipid emulsion include abnormal lipid metabolism, lipid nephrosis, acute pancreatitis if concomitant with or caused by hyperlipidemia, severe egg allergies. The relative contraindications will be a blood coagulation disorder, moderate to severe liver disease, compromised pulmonary function. Minerals and electrolytes. Standard mineral and electrolyte mixtures are available and are designed to meet the normal range of daily mineral or electrolyte requirements. Individual electrolyte levels can be altered to meet the needs of the patient. Now trace elements. Standard trace element mixtures are available. Iron can be given intramuscularly as needed when transferrin levels are low. Free iron increases and can increase susceptibility to infections. Copper supplementation must be administered with caution to avoid toxicity. Extra zinc may be needed by some patients to promote wound healing. Vitamins. Single vitamin supplement can be added to the solution. Vitamin preparation should be added to the parenteral nutrition solution just prior to administration. Water soluble vitamins are provided at levels greater than the RDA since rapid administration exceeds renal threshold. Fat soluble vitamins can become toxic and are provided in amounts equal to the RDA. Vitamin K is not provided, must be given IV or IM at a dose of 2 to 4 milligram per week depending on prothrombin time. Other components. Albumin can be added if serum albumin levels are low. Heparin, an anticoagulant used to prevent blood clots from forming on the IV catheter. Insulin used if needed to regulate blood glucose levels. The complications. Complication is infection. Can occur at the peripheral catheter site, or there can be complications like pneumothorax, hemothorax that can result if the chest wall is perforated with catheter needle, and metabolic complications can be there. So there are a number of complications. Hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia, various electrolytes can get affected, fatty acid, and in renal conditions, azotemia. So it can be, when should you start administration of parenteral nutrition? Should start gradually. Termination should also be gradual. It is good to continue total parenteral nutrition when the tube feeding is started. Pre-operative TPN was seen to be effective only for patients with curable upper GI cancers. Post-operative one indicated for patients who are not anticipated to be started on feeding within 7 to 8 days. For patients started on MV, starting of enteral nutrition in first 24 to 48 hours was found to have a significant effect in patient outcome. Patients who had pancreatidodenectomy despite their nutritional status are not candidates. Thank you.
बॉक्स आएगा
वो
कैसे?
सेव हुआ कि नहीं उसको चेक करना पड़ेगा ना यार। चलो ये तो अपना उसको दे दो। हाँ, आदर्श
आदर्श सर का
हाँ
देना उनको।
हाँ इसको बंद भी कर दो, क्या करना है। वो है क्या अपना
आदर्श सर वहाँ 32 वॉट रहा है।
सेव हुआ कि नहीं चेक करो।